welcome to the series, which I'm sure you've heard about a lot. But today's event is very special because if you ever thought that scholarship and academia may be boring or Soviet culture utterly depressing, our guest speaker today, Mark Lipovetsky, is here to prove that it is not quite true. So Professor Mark Lipovetsky is going to talk on this very populous, very widespread character or protagonist in Soviet culture, Trickster, whose meaning or whose representation extends beyond the traditional meanings of the familiar ideas of a rogue or a deceiver to something that Lipovetsky defines rather as a creative idiot or a sacred clown. So Soviet tricksters became true superstars of the Soviet civilization on the whole, in its both official and non-official realms, and they serve as the cultural justification for dangerous, heroic, and cynical survival by elevating this survival to the level of free play, in which cynicism and freedom somehow interact. Our guest speaker, Mark Lipovetsky, was born in the Urals in Yekaterinburg, where he was educated, received his first education. Since '96, he has lived in the US and worked in a number of American universities. He is the, should I say, the leading authority on post-Soviet and Soviet culture, late Soviet especially, post-Soviet theater, drama, late Soviet non-conformist culture, and numerous other subjects. He's the author of multiple monographs and hundreds of articles, and he is the editor of more recently of a 5-volume complete works of Dmitry Pligov, perhaps the most important Russian conceptualist. He is also, right now at the moment, he is working on a biography of him. He is not only a literary scholar, but also a literary critic, and he has received awards for his own writings, prestigious awards, as well as serving on juries for several literary prizes in Russia and the US. So Mark, it is our honor to be your neighbors, because after years of teaching at University of Colorado at Boulder, Professor Lipovetsky has finally joined Columbia University, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. So for us, it's an honor to be your neighbors, and one can tell already how much Slavic studies, Russian studies, how much more vibrant it has become in the couple of months that Mark has been here. So on this note, let's welcome Professor Lipovetsky.
Thank you very much, Yasha. Thank you for this very flattering introduction, and you make me blush very frequently. And it's a great honor for me to be here, and I heard much about this series. So presenting in front of you is wonderful. Indeed, I will be talking about Soviet tricksters, and I will begin with a very sort of simple, but I guess illuminating example. Probably the most important of Soviet tricksters, the rogue character, is the protagonist of the diptych by Ilya Ilifin and Evgeny Petrov of 2 novels, The 12 Chairs and The Golden Calf, written, the first one published in 1928, the second one in 31, and then the full book publication in 1933. And everybody who lived in Russia, and I guess now lives in Russia, were very much familiar with this work, because there was some kind of encyclopedia of witticisms, right? And then I was quite taken by the fact that after the end of the Soviet Union, across Soviet Union appeared a large number of monuments dedicated to Ostap Bender. So I can show you. So that's the most famous in St. Petersburg. This is Kharkov, Ukraine. This is Pitigorsk. This is Starobelsk, and of course this scene is recognizable to anyone who read the novel. It's the first scene in the 12 chairs where a homeless boy asks for money, and Ostap Bender responds, maybe you want my keys from the apartment where the money is sitting. So it's obvious what he is saying there. That's a monument to Ostap Bender in a lista, and that's next to, and that's why he's holding the chess piece to the newly opened chess palace. And again, those 12 chairs, remember that Ostap Bender was playing the seance of the simultaneous chess game with 30 participants, while he himself was playing this game only the second time in his life. So the his statue right in front of this palace sort of is quite ironical. That's in Chanin in Ukraine. This is in Berdyansk. This is in my native city in Ekaterinburg. And that's a sort of diptych, because here you see Ostap Bender, and next to him you see Kisa Vorobyaninov, who is begging for alms. And that's the monument is next to the bank. Okay, a very ironic location for such a monument. That's Odessa, where the action of both novels, at least partially, take place under different guises, but everybody recognizes Odessa. And you don't see Ostap Bender here, but you see the prized 12 chairs for which the entire hunt in the first novel was going on. And that's huge, as you can see, huge plaque on the building, right, which says that in this building from the 31st of March 1932 to the 1st of April 1932, Ostap Bender worked as a super, and not just Ostap Bender, but his full name, Ostap Suleiman Berta Maria Bender Bey, which appears just once. And again, it's a very loaded reference to the novel, because in the very ending of the second novel of this diptych, after failing dramatically, Ostap Bender says then that I failed as the Count Monte Cristo, now I will become a super. So that's another monument to Ostap Bender. And you can see that the spread of this monument, the spread of these monuments in time is quite also intense. It's across the 90s, and the latest is 2009. Okay, so that we will get back there. This is quite amazing, right? Because indeed it reflects the popularity of the character, but it's a little more than just popularity. So there is some kind of attachment. There is some kind of symbolism associated with this character, and the desire to identify oneself with its presence. We may speculate that easily that Ostap Bender, a rogue, the one who sort of a confidence man, a typical confidence man, becomes the sort of the face of new Russian capitalism. Right? But that would be too sociologically flat, and I think there is something more to it, which I will try to explain. Right, Ostap Bender indeed is just the most visible among Soviet tricksters, and I will later explain why I'm using the term trickster rather than more widespread terms like picaro, rogue, etc. In my sort of collections, one of the first Soviet tricksters was created by Reallife in his very famous and I think underappreciated now novel Julio Kurinita, where the philosophizing trickster appeared, and this novel was written when Ehrenburg sort of escaped Soviet Russia and was spending his first years abroad, but it was published in the Soviet Union with the introduction by Nikolai Bukharin. So there's another edition. Sharikov, despite the fact that the Sharikov is a very unsympathetic character, unlike many other tricksters about which I will be talking today, Sharikov indeed is also a trickster, and Jungian definitions of the trickster, which I will show you a little later, fit perfectly to Sharikov. Right? Of course, a wonderful heroic trickster creates Isaac Babin in his Odessa Tales, and here is the poster for the film of 1926 based on published script. And here is the recently another monument to Mishka Yaponchik, a famous gangster, I guess a gangster, who was the prototype of Babil. The monument is quite elegant. I couldn't resist the temptation to paste in this photograph, because just imagine, so have you ever seen the photograph in which the historical character is sitting barefooted and washing up, maybe sort of how it was called, steaming his feet, some very intimate act that is being placed in public. Furthermore, the fence behind him is the fence of one of Odessa Jewish cemeteries. So it's an absolutely stunning combination of intimate and public, of something almost clownish and something very solemn, as the cemetery suggests. I'm arguing that I'm sure many of you read the famous novel by Yuri Aleshin, Zavist or Envy, the novel of 1927. And there is a very important trickster in this novel, but not many remember him, because he is sort of a second level character. It is Ivan Babichev. Ivan Babichev, the one who preaches about a pillow, and that he is depicted here on the cover, made by Nathan Altman. Quite telling, he places Ivan Babichev on this cover, not other characters, not the sort of builder of the constructivist giant Четвертак, the quarter, and not even the sort of drinking poet Nikolai Kavalerov, who is the narrator there, but Ivan Babichev, who is sort of alternative leader in this novel. Certainly, Bulgakov, in his famous Mas Margarita, presents a huge host of tricksters. I would argue that it's not just one trickster, it's a collective trickster. We have Voland, Satan, as some kind of philosophizing aspect of the trickster, and prankers, sometimes quite dangerous prankers, Behemoth and Koroviev, and as you can see now, they also are transformed into one. So it's very, tricksters tend to be monumentalized for some reason, right? To continue with the gallery, of course there are many others, but I just want to give the spread. There were quite a few characters, real life characters, artists, writers, actors who were exercising in agreement with the modernist sort of style, life creation, sort of ongoing performance. Their behavior was built as the performance, and some of them were performing constant tricksterdom. And Daniel Harms, whom you see on this photograph, is one of these characters. His life consisted of numerous pranks and numerous performances, as one can see, for instance, on this photograph where he's, and you can imagine, he goes to the atelier, he makes a photograph, and in this photograph he is dressed up as his brother. He never had a brother, so he's a completely fictional character. If we go on, we can think of Yasha's, one of Yasha's scholarship character, Andrei Sinyavsky, Abram Terz, who was constantly sort of balancing on the verge of tricksterdom and seriousness, and tricksterdom and martyrdom, and he was never sort of fully congruent to oneself, and as you probably know, he existed under the pen name Abram Terz, which he used in the Soviet Union to publish texts abroad. But when he, after the time in prison, when he emigrated, he continued publishing some articles, some texts as Andrei Sinyavsky, and others as Abram Terz. And Abram Terz is the name from the urban folklore song about a thief, another phase of the trickster. And if we read Abram Terz, for instance, if you read his one of his early novellas, In the Circus, he directly establishes the connection between the tricksterdom and the authorship. The author and the trickster, for him, are the same figure. Later on, when in prison, when in labor camp, he will be writing a famous, scandalous book, Strolls with Pushkin, where he depicts Pushkin, who, of course, for Russian culture is the poet, right? The author as the permanent trickster who never is himself, who always dons a mask, right? Another important trickster, rather than comical only, is Vinchka Yerofeev from the author and the character, mainly the character here, of course, of the famous narrative poem Moskva Petushki, which in English is more frequently translated as Moscow to the end of the line, and here again you can see him monumentalized in Moscow. My character, my hero, Dmitry Prigov, a famous poet, experimentator, theorist, playwright. He was very cerebral man. He was a man with a plan, man with a project, but his project was paradoxical. He rationally designed his entire life and his entire creative work as the constant trickster's act, which lasted since the early 70s until his untimely death in 2007. But surprisingly, so all these characters that I showed you, they more or less belong to the non-conformist culture, especially, of course, Sinyavsky, Yerofeev, Prigov. But if we look at the Soviet culture, we also will find a number of characters that strongly rely on the trickster tradition. Most frequently they appear in comedies, of course, because Trickster is a comedic character. So here you can see Kostya Muzikant, Kostya the musician in the, I never can remember how it's being translated, happy, go, something, so cheerful guys, right? The Trickster appears in the strangest place in the concentration camp, in the Soviet concentration camp, in the film based on the play by Nikolai Pogodin that sort of depicts the reforging, the so-called reforging of the prisoners in the Gulag, the film of the mid-30s, and there was a famous trickster, Kostya the Captain, but actually there was also a very interesting book, interesting in a peculiar way, of course, the book about the building and builders of the White Sea, Baltic Sea Canal, Belomoro-Baltijsky Canal, named after Stalin, the book published in 1936 and edited by Gorky, and the commander of this concentration camp, to name the words by his words, by its true names, and Mikhail Zoshenko, another famous Soviet writer, wrote for this volume a portrait of Rosenberg, an international con man, actually, the man who was running huge operations and who is now in this camp undergoing reforging, and in the culmination point of this story, Rosenberg sort of decides to become the Stakhanovite, to become sort of a good Soviet socialist guy, and Zoshenko, of course, delivers this story with a straight face, but any reader, because before that we learn about his fantastic operations in comparison to which Ostap Bender is just a petty crook, international. We understand that probably Rosenberg is running another of his cons, right? So he could pretend to be American capitalist. Why cannot he pretend to be Soviet Stakhanov, right? Yulis Maxima, the Youth of Maxima, is the first film of the pretty famous trilogy about the Bolsheviks, sort of sample Bolshevik. Its creator, Grigory Kozintsev, wrote that we wanted to make a film about Soviet Till Eulenspiegel. Till Eulenspiegel is the German tricksters. Yeah, Belgium, sorry, thank you so much. Yeah, of course. Flandre, right, Flandre. Right, and so in the first part, he's indeed a prank-playing guy who pretends to be drunk, pretends to be somebody else in order to trick the police, but later on he becomes basically the Chekist, and he uses the same tricks as the Chekist. So the trick system is being co-opted into the system there. There was, again, some people would remember this famous, fantastic, extremely talented actor Pyotr Aleynikov, who played in a number of films, and he was sort of created to be the trickster. He was cast as the trickster. And wherever he appeared, the aura of tricksterdom would follow him, which sometimes played sad jokes on him, because in the post-war film, which was very sort of serious film about Glinka, famous Russian composer, he appears as Pushkin. And according to the memories of people who are coming to the movies, watching this film, when Oleninov would appear on the screen as Pushkin, the audience would laugh, roaring laughter, screaming, Vanya Kursky, that was his famous trickster's role, is Pushkin. So it was impossible to separate him from his trickster's parts. Of course, the very, very sort of calm, very smoothly represented trickster is Vasily Terkin in the famous wartime poem by Twardowski, and you can see a few others. I wouldn't go further, but there is another interesting moment where the tricksters appear in the Soviet official culture. They appear as the shadow character next to the tyrant. They sort of double the tyrant. And probably add some human dimension to quite inhuman face of the ruler, as we can see, for instance, in the films about Peter the Great, where Mikhail Zharov plays Menshikov as the trickster next to him, and the same role belongs to him in the novels by Alexei Tolstoy that serve as the literary basis for this film. And the parody of this connection you will see in Bulgakov's play not one day. Sorry, Ivan Vasilievich Changes the Occupation, which was later translated into very popular comedy in 1973. But here you can see Yuri Yakovlev that pretends to be the Tsar, and the thief, trickster, who pretends to be his advisor. But very seriously, the same combination appears in Ivan the Terrible, the film by Eisenstein, where Maluda Skuratov is somewhat trickster, but the most important trickster's scene is the scene of the dance of Oprichniki, where young Basmanov appears as the trickster, who sort of even combines different gender identities, and that's a very dangerous trickster, represented more plastically than verbally there, but it is there. Right. Furthermore, Lenin appears in a number of films, especially the films by Mikhail Rohm, unintentionally, I would say so. As the trickster character, his entire representation is incredibly comical. He's constantly fidgeting. He's constantly throwing some very much inappropriate jokes. And not by chance, Shukin, who played Lenin, was his employer. He was cast as the comical actor, and using Shukin for Lenin was a very important gesture, and it had its own reasons. Lenin paradoxically served as the background for serious, responsible, and not fidgeting Stalin. Right. So it was a different kind of a game, but the tricks appeared there. And again, we can think of different characters in official Soviet culture whose live performance was tricksters, and Faina Ranevskaya, a famous actress, who played a number of roles. Some of them are wonderful, some of them are not so much wonderful, but she is followed by the trace of folklore, of her jokes, of her pranks, of her misbehaviors. And this folklore actually completely sort of overpowers whatever we know about this actress, and that's her cultural presence now. And again, you can see the monument. Right? There are others. I think it's too much. Right? So if you want, I can go on, and I have already used too much time. So I hope I have convinced you that there are very many tricksters in Soviet official and non-official culture. But the trickster, of course, is the very, very ancient character. It appears in mythology, and basically the concept of trickster is developed through the study of mythology, of North American mythologies. And here again, as I have a list, I won't be reading it, of various tricksters in the different mythological pantheons and in early forms of literature. And then Trickster sort of transforms into a number of characters. Basically, Trickster produces a whole spectrum of characters, a whole spectrum of types, right? The most characteristic sort of derivative of the Trickster trope or the Trickster myth is a picaro, and picaresque novel is the novel about the sort of the secular trickster, right? But also when adopted in the Christian tradition, especially Eastern Christian tradition, the trickster turns into a holy fool, although it's somewhat specific trickster, but nevertheless the trickster's genealogy is quite obvious in this character. We can speak about, we can see the connections with the trickster in such figures as the impostor, right, as thief, of course, and thief's folklore, as I mentioned, right, and number of other figures. But as you can see, for instance, by the references to Fielding, to Defoe, right, to Lesage, you can see that, and Beaumarchais, of course, that the trickster, or the rock figure as it's typically defined, is very important for the cultural history of modernity. This character had become probably the prototypical modern man. The man who is separated from any kind of cultural tradition, the man of the road, the man who fluctuates between identities and doesn't have any stable identity. Basically, the trickster constantly changes identity, constantly changes faces, right? Quite innocently, of course, the early forms of tricksterdom are said with male characters, but quite early in the 18th century we see Molly Flanders, a sort of prototypical female trickster in Defoe's novel, right? Generally, the attitude to this character in European literature and later in American literature is quite positive, right? So think about Figaro, think about Tom Sawyer, right? All these are, especially Huckleberry Finn, so very, very attractive, very appealing characters. Not so in classical Russian literature. In classical Russian literature, and we have a Gogol expert here, so I'm trying to be very much restrained. Trickster is not a very appealing character. Probably the most appealing is Khristakov, although I wouldn't say that he is a role model, right? If you place him next to Figaro, you will see that Figaro is almost heroic character, and Khristakov is not, right? When Gogol depicts the character who definitely had absorbed multiple characteristics of the trickster, Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov, the protagonist of The Dead Souls, in the last chapter of the first volume, the first completed volume, right, Gogol calls him the scoundrel. И так припряжем же подлеца, he says. So he is not fond of this character, for sure, right? And he has to go some transformations to become a human being, a true human being, in Gogol's vision of this novel. When we look at Dostoevsky, who directly sort of, for his entire life, is in conversation with Gogol, Dostoevsky has multiple trickster characters, but they are all absolutely repelling, right? He has Svidrigailov in Crime and Punishment, right? Marmelade, yes, he's also a trickster character. He's sort of Svidrigailov's double, in a certain way. But in the Karamazov brothers, he has Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, the father, and of course Mernikov. In Biesa de Pazas, he has Petrusha Verkhovensky, so the master trickster, and they're all quite negatively depicted, right? And in the entire Russia, we won't find any monuments dedicated to any of these characters. Quite interesting, right? However, in the Soviet period, the situation changes drastically, as I tried to show you. And the trickster, although this character is never sort of lacking ambivalence, it is a very ambivalent character. Ambivalence is a sort of defining feature. It is incredibly attractive. It is incredibly appealing, right? And as Yasha said, it is indeed the star of the Soviet civilization, right? And that's some kind of the mystery that I'm trying to resolve, and I'm writing about this now. But before we go to more specific talk, let me jump a little bit into theory. The first, at least I know, the first more or less systematic of the Trickster, 1956, the famous book, The Trickster, Study in American Indian Mythology, edited by Paul Rodin, the father figure of American folklore studies. This book also includes Jung's article about the Trickster. And as you can see, so the definition that they give there, they're quite philosophical and broad, but they're worth reading, I would say. Trickster is at one and the same time creator, destroyer, giver, negator, who have dupes others, he who dupes others and who is always duped himself. He knows neither good nor evil, yet he is responsible for both. He possesses no values, moral or social, is at the mercy of his passions and appetites, yet through his actions all values come into being. That's Paul Rodin. And Chanin, emigrant from Hungary, writes, disorder belongs to the totality of life, and the spirit of this disorder is the trickster. His function in archaic, or rather the function of his mythology, of the tales told about him, is to add disorder to order, and so to make a whole. To render possible within the fixed bounds of what is permitted an experience of what's not permitted. Dionysian ecstasy has the same function as the trickster myth. It abolishes the boundaries, not least the boundaries of sense. So in the first definition, we see trickster as defined as sort of in more contemporary language, blurring the binary positions, combining the opposite ends of any kind of binary, being good and evil, man and woman, high and low. And later, this definition has been expanded by Claude Lévi-Strauss in his famous structuralist theory of myth, where the trickster was depicted as the mediator between different spheres, and first of all between the world of gods and the world of humans, and also sort of traveling into the underworld. Chanin adds another sort of a different aspect, so that he is always a chaotic character. He is the manifestation of chaos, right? And however, paradoxically, this chaos is not only destructive. It is destructive, all right, but it is not only destructive, it's also creative. And in the myths that we know, and that's not my formula, so scholars find it, the trickster creates by destruction. The trickster is sort of double to the culture character, which builds the civilization, but the trickster sort of constantly mocks this culture character. But at the same time, this mockery is also created. This mockery is also producing the world. I'm not using the concept of the trickster as the concept of archetype as something given, as something sort of ready-made and waiting to be applied as some kind of matrix to existing characters. I prefer here to use the concept of a trope. And here is the definition of a trope by Yuri Lokman, where he ignores that, where he emphasizes that the trope combines both something existing in culture and something new. That the trope is always a dialogical structure, and it is based on the resonance, or lack of thereof, or contrast, right, between the pre-existing cultural models and new life material. And that's how Trickster functions, due to the fact that it is a very popular character, and due to the fact that even without knowing this word, we are familiarizing ourselves with the tricksters since childhood, through fairy tales, through various kinds of mythology, through children's books, and children's books are full of tricksters, especially Soviet children's books. The rule of tricksters, right? We recognize the trickster, and we sort of recognize this character in contemporary setting as well, right? But it is always some kind of changing distance between what is present and what is new, right? And this changing distance has the critical meaning because it sort of serves as the instrument for reading of contemporary world. Tricksters are incredibly contemporary. It's actually hard to imagine some kind of the work. Oh no, I'm wrong. There are works about history about Trickster in it. Sorry, I take this back. So to summarize what defines the Tricksters, I sort of have these four main principles based on existing literature. So first of all, the Trickster is always ambivalent and always liminal. So the Trickster always exists between cultural orders in the no man land, or rather he or she creates this no man land around herself or himself, right? As William Heinz, a scholar of mythology, says, he's anomalous, without normativity, on the edge, just beyond existing borders, classification, categories, and out persons. And his activities are often outlandish, outrageous, out of bounds, and out of order. And no borders are sacrosanct, be they religious, cultural, linguistic, epistemological, metaphysical. He constantly crosses these borders, moves swiftly and impulsively back and forth across all borders with viral impunity, in continual transit through all realms, marginal and liminal. Right? And you may take any Trickster, for instance, take Ostap Bender, and you will see how these characteristics work out in this character with one very important twist. It is always coupled with comedy. It is always coupled with witticism. And basically, the humor is born from this constant crossing of borders and this constant combining of ambivalent characters and ambivalent categories, ambivalent discourses, etc. But Trickster naturally plays tricks, right? Naturally, sort of, this can be pranks, that can be quite dangerous tricks, deception, but and Tricksters not necessarily are completely selfless, right? For instance, if we are with Ostap Bender, in the first novel, he's seeking treasures hidden in one of the chairs in the furniture set, right? And in the second novel, he's basically blackmailing a secret millionaire, and so he tries to get a million and gets it, right? So there is an important material incentive associated with the tricks, but in the novels about Ostap Bender, it's quite obvious that this incentive is actually playing a secondary role. In the end of the novel, second novel, The Golden Calf, when Ostap Bender finally has his million, he feels losing the sense of living. He is a vital character, he is a vibrant character, and suddenly he doesn't want to live. Right, and he hears how pigeons are saying, umru, umru, I will die. And eventually he decides to live the solitude and to transform all his money into gold, into riches, and cross the Dniester, right? Dniester by ice sort of to Romania, where he's robbed by Romanian border patrol. But this entire journey is journey to death, because he himself says that what is the foreign life for a certain person? It is the nether world. It is the world of death. Right? And what happens with him on the ice again? Liminal zones, sort of on the parallels with sticks are quite relevant here. Is the traveler into death, right? So you may even read it as some kind of form of suicide. Of course, Ilya Petrov were justifying this sudden change of heart of their wonderful, energetic character by the fact that the money don't have any weight under socialism. But anyone who read the novel understands how preposterous is this claim, because before that moment, the money did have much weight under socialism, and they were functioning very, very well, right? And there was lots of underworld activities that the money could buy. and suddenly they just lose their significance. And I think that's exactly because for Ostap Bender, as for any trickster, the trick is not about material gain, it is about art. The trick is an art form, the trick is self-sufficient, the trick is a form of performance, right? And therefore, this is why in many texts about the trickster we see the theatricality, we see the theater. Many of you read the Mass and Margarita, and the host of devils and demons appear in Bulgakov's contemporary Moscow. It's actually hard to say when they appear, either in the end of the 20s or mid-30s. It's a blurred territory here. But for some reason, all the activities are centered around the theater. All people with whom they encounter are sated with the theater. And of course, the culmination of the power of the Satan is the theatrical performance, right? You may say, okay, Bulgakov was the man of the theater, he knew this well, but it doesn't work for me. Another part of this novel is about Jesus Christ and Pontius Pilate, right? He wasn't there. So it's not about his presence. I have another example. The children's story from the same period about the Trickster 2, the Soviet version of Pinocchio, Buratino, written by Alexei Tolstoy, one of the sort of founders of the official Soviet culture. And there again, everything happens around the theater. And the theater is the most cherished prize for the character. Quite interestingly, Tolstoy had an intention just to write a Russian version of Pinocchio, which he did actually back in 1922. He was doing this once again. And if you remember Pinocchio always wants to stop being a marionette, stop being a puppet, right? No, he's a marionette, he's not a puppet, but puppet in a metaphorical sense. And to become a boy, a real boy. His counterpart in this story, a wooden boy, Buratino, right? Buratino is he doesn't want to become a human. He has no interest in becoming a human. He wants to have his own theater. Right? He doesn't want to play in somebody else's theater, right? He wants to sort of to produce his own show, but there is no interest. And quite another thing, you remember how traumatized is poor Pinocchio when he lies, right? So he has his growing nose. As to Buratino, he's born with a long nose. And his long nose stays as long as possible, for as long as he lives. He's liar by default. It's not his vice, it's not his defect, right? It is his defining feature, right? And certainly again, Alexei Tolstoy was projecting himself onto this character. Even in contemporary productions about tricksters, modern productions, for instance, if you remember the movie, if you saw it, that very Munchausen based on Grigori Gorin's play, it is very theatrical. There are moments when Munchausen, who is of course the trickster, conducts the orchestra, who is in the within the frame, so he sort of breaks the fourth wall and transforms the film into the theatrical production. If you remember another very important Tricksters film, Beware of the Car, the film of 1966, also so there is some kind of timid trickster there. But it is very important that this trickster meets with his investigator at the stage of the amateur theater where they both participate in the production of Hamlet. Right? And this timid trickster is playing Hamlet, while his investigator is playing Laertes. And in the very end, when he's already arresting, he leaves the stage with flowers. He's happy. That's his triumph, although he's technically failed. Right? So theater is very important. Another quite interesting characteristic of the trickster is associated with its genealogy. Of course, the trickster is the part of the ritual. The trickster is indeed the sacred clown. Is indeed the one who mocks gods, who breaks taboos by this means, sort of showing how taboo function, right? And that's why this connection with the sacred, I'm arguing, are present in any important, interesting trickster figure, including Soviet culture. Right? However, the sacred is quite paradoxical. It is the sacred that is best defined by Georges Bataille's idea of potlatch, idea of expenditure, idea of sort of spending everything, destroying even everything valuable, and by this means demonstrating one's superiority over these values of the normal world. So as Bataille writes, through potlatch, through the expenditure, you establish the intimacy with the world. And for instance, you can find the example from Babel's Odessa Tales, where young thief, future king of thieves, so the trickster himself, establishes himself by destroying, by sort of spectacles of destruction. Right, and in this description that you can see in English, Babel is definitely fond of this visuality, of this sort of splendor of expenditure. And the words of Bataille work very well here. It appears that sacred things are constituted by the operation of loss, and that's the loss is produced by the trickster who destroys everything, including his own fortune and his own life. The trickster story rarely ends with trickster's sort of success, stability, etc. It ends with self-destruction. So, and if we look at this sort of bird's eye and the story of the trickster Soviet culture, here I see several periods, right? So if we look at the tricksters of the 1920th, right, and even I believe that there is a difference between Ostap Bender in the first novel, 1928, and in the second novel, the 30s. In all these novels, the relation of the sacred is most important. The trickster, of course, in all these novels, by default, by the situation, is associated with the revolution, right? And the trickster appears as the character who criticizes revolution, who at the same time represents revolution, right? Who is the product of the revolution, and who is at the same time the resistance to the fruits of the revolution. So this ambivalence is quite important. But where the sacred, they all use mythological plots, quite openly, and these mythological plots in Ehrenburg's Julia Kurinita, in Alesha's Envy, in Babel's Odessa Tales, and to some extent in 12 Chairs, they are set with Judeo-Christian mythology. They are telling, especially Julia Kurinita, it is the story of the new Christ, the story of the new prophet who didn't teach anything. And he has disciples, and one of his disciples telling the story of the teacher, he calls him the teacher, right? And it ends with the sort of very much detailed inversion of Christ's crucifixion, right? So he also eats a pear, right? But he ends in the gutter rather than on the cross, right? He seeks the ending by himself, but he is indeed the teacher, and all stories in his life, anecdotal, funny, they are parables. They're very much Christian parables. And Ostap Bender, yes, he looks as the most not sacred character, but the ending there is quite strange, because in the ending of this novel, his partner in crime slices his throat in order to get the final chair. But in 2 years, Ostap Bender is resurrected. So he is there again, right? He never dies. He's dying and resurrecting God. Playful God, blasphemous God nonetheless. Right? In Alesha's Envy, Ivan Babich appears as the new Christ, and there is a story where he comes to the wedding, right? And pronounces the speech that your closest ones are your worst enemies. Don't get wedded. You're wedding to your murderer, right? And as a result of this speech, all wine turned into water, right? So that's the of course inversion of the famous Christ's miracle.
As to, of course, Sharikov with the heart of a dog, these are the stories about the man-animal figure, about the totemic myth, right? So sort of the transformation from the animal into a human being and back again. So I don't think that they're Christian, but nevertheless, each of these stories tells a story of a new Messiah. Each of them appears as a Messiah. Some of these messiahs, like Benya Krikin one of these stories, right? It is indeed a Jewish Messiah who came from the underworld, right, to destroy this world. He's the king of Jews, literally, right? One of the stories, he's called the king, right? And he's preceded the Messiah. He's sort of marked by his messianic mission, right? But at the same time, certainly, what is his messianism is about thiefdom, about beating his own father to death, etc. Many other quite scary things, but he is perceived as a messiah. And the signs of messianism is in Ostap Bender quite obviously, not accidentally. In the second novel, he constantly wears a captain's cap and says that he will be commanding the parade. He is the commander, not Bender. He is. Right? And of course, in all of them, the Messiah is a trickster. The Messiah is not the one who brings the message of coming kingdom of God or stable values. On the contrary, their message is that values are not stable anymore. That all values are convertible in their opposite. Right? That there is nothing stable. And that's the messianism, or sort of the message that the trickster manifests, of course, in the Age of Revolution. Quite obvious, I guess. But, and I promised to tell you that Sharikov is indeed the trickster, although we don't like him. And that's quite interesting that all the tricksters that sort of remained in Soviet culture, they all are intellectually brilliant. They are interesting. And Sharikov is probably the only one trickster who is not, right? And that's why sort of he almost never is interpreted as a trickster, but read these characteristics of the trickster by Jung. That's about Sharikov, right? And even his doubling of his maker, Professor Preobrazhensky, who stands for God, definitely, and he appears as God in his visions and during the surgery, right? It is very much part of this ancient trickster's myth, and which Jung is interpreting here. Tricksters of the 30s, they surprisingly are all about the second kind. Right? It is the playful variation, playful staging of the second kind, right? Because certainly Satan and demons coming to Moscow, what for? Right? It is some form of playful apocalypse that, of course, persists. The second coming of Christ, or at least that the expectation never happens. Right? And actually, the one who can become Christ is evacuated from there. There will be no second coming. It's failed second coming. Right? They come with the inspection, where the second coming will happen there. They find a Christ-like figure. They understand that this figure is already crashed, and that's not the Christ material anymore, and they evacuate him into some kind of the limbo. We don't even know where. We don't understand that. He will have light. He doesn't deserve light, he deserves peace. What's peace? Limbo. Right? They appear in a world that's somewhat different than the world in the 1920s. The world in the 20th is the world in flux. Everything is changing, and they sort of are the embodiment of this transformation in all possible directions, moral and immoral. It's quite characteristic. One of the myth scholars writes that the trickster is not immoral, not amoral. The trickster is not immoral. The trickster is amoral, outside. Right, and that's why they can play all parts there. Here they come to the society that is already stabilized, but it's stabilized in a very strange form, in the form of the staunch cynicism. Actually, everyone that they encounter, and of course the Mas Margarita and the Golden Cup here are very illuminating. None of them have any, I don't know, convictions into revolution or into anything else at all. They're all survivors. They're all ready to play whatever role they can do. And the trickster there, in comparison with these cynics, appear as an artist, appear as a poet, right? Which is quite obvious in both cases, right? And as these poets, they create these comedic avatars, right? So here we see the strange conflict between the trickster and the cynic, right? And if we are thinking about the trickster more or less historically, and this thought has been already performed, so it's my job just to cite it properly. The trickster appears as the not only manifestation of this world in flux in the 20s, but also as the manifestation of the Soviet cynicism, because cynicism becomes sort of modus vivendi of the Soviet civilization. It's hard to say when exactly, of course, but in the 30s it's definitely there. Right? Although Sheila Fitzpatrick, a famous social historian, she argues that the very logic of the Soviet identity formation forced people to become cynical, because the social status and everything derivative of it was based on the identity. Therefore, identity was, and this acceptable and non-acceptable identities, their definitions were constantly changing. In the 20s, it was all right to be a peasant. In the end of 20s, you couldn't be just a peasant. You should have been a poor peasant. Wealthy peasant was a questionable thing, not just questionable, just a new face of the enemy of the people, right? And then comes the period of the Great Terror with its great, although borrowed term, the enemy of the people, which completely removed any class designation of the enemy. In the 20th and even early 30s, it was the class that sort of defined who are you, right? And that's why people were inventing their stories, and writing of autobiographies was the sort of normal sort of ritual associated with job placement, application to the university, to school. Anyway, people were inventing their identities, inventing themselves, constantly sort of sliding between different identities. But in the 30s, with the end of the people concept, even this started to be very, it's almost impossible. It was not defined who is the enemy. The enemy could be anyone, right? The enemy of the people is, it can be Bukharin, it can be a saboteur, right? So how to define itself? So people had constantly to transform themselves. There was no stability, and that's where she uses the Ostap Bender as prototypical of Soviet man in her book Theo of the Mask, which is entirely based on this constant masking and unmasking of the Soviet people. Oleg Karkorgin, another historian, he wrote a book about the rituals of repentance, rituals of that were also quite typical in the 30s and even 40s, early 50s. And he argues that these rituals, they shape a cynical subject, right? They shape an individual perfection of the mechanism for constant switching between the intimate and the official, a curious kind of unofficial self-training, a process that comes later than the initial stage of dissimulation, conceived as closing off with Worcester, and one that we may more aptly call dissimulation as changing faces. It's a meaning, right? Even more so, Slavoj Žižek, a famous philosopher, he argued that cynicism is at the core of the soul. It's not only the form of mimicry that ordinary people had to perform, but he argues that it is at the core of the Soviet sort of political model, and a whole series of markers delivered between the lines, the injunction that such official exhortation was not to be taken too literally, that a cynical attitude towards the official ideology was what the regime really wanted, the greatest catastrophe for the regime would have been for its own ideology to be taken seriously and realized by its subjects. So basically we may argue that cynicism is quite typical for this Soviet system since its early ages, and it's definitely highlighting feature in its late period, as shown in Alexei Yevchak's seminal book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. There is some connection between this and the trickster. The easiest thing is to say that the trickster is indeed the cynic. The trickster is the cynic, but special kind. So my theoretical foundation here is Peter Sloterdijk and his book, Critique of Cynical Reason, written in 1984, where he argues that cynic, of course, is not a Soviet phenomenon. He actually not even mentions Soviet cynics. He believes that the Soviet society is free of cynicism. For him, cynicism goes from Diogenes, Marquis de Sade, and his sort of top example is Weimar Republic, which produces Nazi cynicism, as his argument goes. But for him, cynicism mainly is the sort of disappointed product of modernity. The product of modernity for whom the demands, the challenges of modernity are too hard, and therefore he or she just mimics, just pretends, right? And pretends according to the station. However, cynic is always pragmatic. Cynic is always self-serving, right? And we understand this, right? The characters that the tricksters manifest there, as I tried to emphasize, they are not self-serving even when they are pursuing some material goals. However, as Sloterdijk wisely writes, cynicism is quite invincible. And contemporary, for instance, Russian regime showed that sort of brought cynicism to a new level of artistry. It is invincible, right? So any kind of critique is shielded by quite cynic response. Aren't you doing the same thing? So it's played out by Sloterdijk. Sloterdijk, of course, is the Bible of the post-Soviet regime. And Sloterdijk writes that no critique can cope with this gelatinous realism. For critique cannot achieve any validity when it is not confronted by an ignorance. Even a critique that itself becomes cynical in order to smash the predominant cynicism is deflected. And he finds the only opposition to cynicism in what he calls kinesis. Right? And that's a strange word to which I return. But just to confirm or to support my claim that Trickster is fighting against cynic or cynicism in certain ways. I can give you a few examples. So that's, by the way, a very smart illustration to the Golden Calf, in which Kukrelnik's official Soviet artists, by the way, a group of Soviet writers who were famous by their caricatures in official newspapers. And they created very talented illustrations to this novel. They depict Ostap Bender and his nemesis, Karika, as two profiles, of course, referring to Marx and Engels or Lenin and Stalin, so leaders of the world, and this circle is quite telling. But we can see, right? We can see that the fight between Trickster and cynics is at the center of many texts there, right? In Odessa Tales, in Julia Kurnita, in Ivan Petrov's diptych, in every novel, for instance, at first he meets a naive Kisa Vorobyaninov, who by the end of the novel becomes a very much seasoned cynic, much more cynical than Ostap Bender, and so cynical that he kills his partner in order to grab the prize, right? And Karika, whom Ostap Bender blackmails in the Golden Calf, is indeed sort of a super cynic. And the difference between Ostap Bender and Karika quite interesting, that Ostap constantly wastes, constantly spends, right? His whatever he gains, right? And Karika lives the life of a monk, right? He cannot afford he has the money, but he cannot afford spending them even when he wants, when he in love, right? Because that would unmask him, right? Or they write about him that Alexander Ivanovich Karika knew only 2 roles in his life, of the grey Soviet mouse and the underground millionaire. No other roles were accessible to him. And Ostap Bender is a spectrum of roles. Right? Etc. We can see these differences. In my perception, the most important scene there is when Ostap Bender spends the entire night trying to squeeze out the money from Karika, and there's a debate, it's sort of parodies, etc., etc., etc. And eventually Karika says, okay, I will give you the money, let's go to the place where I hide them, and take some package with him, so that they go to the street, and suddenly there's hall of some kind of sirens and training for the gas attack, and Karika immediately puts on the gas mask on his face and disappears in the crowd of the same masked fake people. He's no different from them. He just disappears, and Ostap is sort of wounded. He's taken into the shelter. But the fact that the Karika is immediately disappearing in the crowd is very much emphasizing the difference between him and the trickster. The trickster stands up by the fact that he's outside of all norm, and the trickster and the cynic is normal and even normal, right? And that's the point of the story. In the Mass Margarita, there are readings, so they appear as the host of Trickster, that whom they constantly prank. Cynics, of course, who are all these people whom they force to sort of expose themselves. They, of course, they're very cynical. We see the most cynical character, not one of the cynical characters in the very first stages, right? Virtuoso, who teaches the young character how to sell oneself, right? How to be cynical, how to manipulate with things sacred for others. I believe that this novel is also quite important. So in the one plane of this story that unfolds in contemporary Moscow, we see, as I said, this host of tricksters. On the other, we see the biblical story, so sort of the story of Christ's crucifixion. And here we see a mega cynic, Pontius Pilate, who is depicted with the utmost affection, I would say. That's the first time when we see a cynical character depicted with so much affection. Right, this sort of reflects the stage of the 30s, when cynicism is sort of stabilized. And it's sympathetic when it's displayed by smart people. Right. Vianichka and the angels, I believe that they're super cynics, and the god is cynic there. But it's a long story. And we can go further to Pilevin's novels, etc. And of course, Pussy Riot and the Judges, that they display this story once again, just without script. Right. So back to Sloterdijk and back to the Trickster. So the Trickster probably manifests and transforms what Sloterdijk defines as cynicism. Right. And cynicism is basically cynicism without pragmatism. Cynicism that doesn't serve one's needs, and it's just playful for the sake of its critical impulse, right? Critical, ironical philosophy of the so-called needs, in the elucidation of their fundamental excess and absurdity, right? In their snobism towards grand goals, in their shamelessness, in their sort of bodily performances. For Sloterdijk, the first and foundational cynic is Diogenes, the one about whom we know the stories, with his confrontations with Alexander, right? With sort of, go away, you're blocking the sun from me, with his sort of parodies on Plato's philosophy, when Plato defines human being as bird without feathers. So Diogenes, according to the legends, brings a chicken from the market. So that's the human. And publicly masturbating and sort of explaining that that's how he treats his needs, and it would be better if hunger would be treated the same way. So things like that, they stand for cynicism in Sloterdijk interpretation. I wouldn't say that all the characters that I'm describing are exactly like this, but they are manifesting this playful, artistic, critical side of cynicism. Cynicism is not a side. They're manifesting this form of cynicism, right? And they married with the authors married with the Trickster's tradition and create powerful characters, which, on the one hand, sort of create the excuse for cynical performance. So people have to live cynical lives. They maybe don't want, but that's some kind of inevitability. And they show it's okay. You can do it without damaging yourself. You can do it and use cynicism to exercise your freedom. They on the one hand, even poeticize cynicism. Right? On the other hand, they criticize it. And that's a place why they're so popular, right? Because they stand on the sort of nexus of attitudes to the central characteristics of Soviet civilization. Okay, so what happens with the Trickster further? In the 60s, we see the appearance of the different kind of the Trickster that becomes mainly a poet. Basically this experimental cynicism, right? That playfulness, that this outlandish behavior, it all transformed into the sphere of art and life as art. Right? The Trickster becomes a non-conformist poet. That's very important, right? And his typical character, his non-conformism is bordering with self-destruction. It actually requires self-destruction for its manifestation, exactly because it does not belong to the mainstream of the cynical society. However, these Tricksters are becoming more and more romanticized. And of course, the most romantic of these Tricksters is Baron Munchausen in the Soviet movie of 1979. Those of you who remember the stories about Baron Munchausen, original stories created in the 18th century by Raspa, and then traveling across the world, producing numerous variations. It's not a romantic character in the least, right? It is a liar. It's an obsessive liar, right? However, in the movie of 1979 by the film director Mark Zakharov, based on the play by Grigory Munchausen, who has been played probably by the most attractive actor of the Soviet cinema, Oleg Yankovsky, appears as the person who actually says the truth. Well, this truth is completely unconventional and goes against all borders, against all sort of boring cynical norms. He dares to be free, right? And that's why he's marginalized, he's persecuted, he's forced to perform his death, and then he again resurrects, and etc., etc. And climbs the Jacob's ladder, obviously because he climbs to heaven. Where else could he go? So it is some kind of the return of this messianic Trickster, but in a very romantic way. It was maybe the highest point in the story of the Soviet Trickster. That then followed some kind of decline and further transformation. But there was another character of the Trickster that was developing along the lines with this romantic Trickster. The Trickster, the ordinary Trickster, I would say, the Trickster from the masses, right? And those of you who remember this movie, Aphonia by Georgi Daneliev, you remember that the Trickster there is a janitor who constantly lies, tricks people for some trifles, right? But basically, we see a very, very nasty character, very destructive character. And I started thinking about these characters and found out that there are many of them. And these Tricksters, unlike their counterparts, are conformists. They're trying to live according to the norms of the society. However, they possess this excess of playfulness. They sort of overdo the norm, and by this means, this playfulness leads them to transgressions, and these transgressions lead them to self-destruction. But if Munchausen and other characters sort of non-conformist bind, they indeed manifest romantic freedom. These characters manifest only the longing for freedom. However, they don't know how to achieve it, how to express it, and that's the sad story is. So not the sad story. So the double to beautiful Munchausen is Makarov from the film Flights in Dreams and in Reality, played by the same Minkowski. So it's very simple to place them next to each other because there is a certain doubling of these characters. So I think that I should probably stop here and not go into the post-story development because it's another 30 minutes, and I don't want to steal your entire evening. But just to sum up, in a certain way, we may use for the trickster and for the player aside from this idea of the two sides of cynicism, and justification, and at the same time resistance to it by playing with right? The idea of the power of the powers, the idea that the concept was coined by Václav Havel in his famous article. All these characters are alienated from power, and we may use the concept from the post-colonial theater, subalterns. So are they subalterns? In many ways, they are, because indeed they do not have any access to power whatsoever. But subaltern, according to Spivak, is a position without identity. The trickster turns this position without identity into the juggling by multiple identity, none of which sticks, right? None of which is his or her own. Subaltern only can speak through languages of power and authority. The trickster does the same. The trickster masterfully imitates languages of power and authority. That's part of his or her performance, but does this in a mocking way, does this in a satirical way, in a comical way, right? Therefore, he presents the performative legitimization of one's own freedom through a paradox and catastrophe, as the theorist of postmodernism predicted. So we may even say that the trickster, trickster, is the first postmodernist that appears way before postmodernism gained this name, and that his or her performance is the postmodernist performance, sort of avant-garde. Thank you so much.
We still have about 20 minutes at most, maybe 15 for questions, which may include questions about what happens to Trickster in the post-Soviet era.
That should happen.
You mentioned Ninchikov with the Great, and he is obviously like the king's fool, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a slightly different category. I was wondering whether the Urodziewicz figure is also related to the Trickster.
Yeah, of course.
I'm thinking of that because I remember Siniavsky, who came to an Imsa conference and read an interesting paper about the Imsa as Urodziewicz. And it sort of clicked with Siniavsky himself, of course. But yeah.
So the fact that the trickster may be under somebody's foot is not contradicting this idea of the power of the powers, right? Mm-hmm. So under the foot, but from there you're sort of exercising whatever mechanics. With Urodziewicz definitely employs multiple tricksters' acts, right? And Urodziewicz, they call it, right, employs the paradox, the ambivalence, the liminality, the performatism, right? However, Urodziewicz is never undermining the values, Christian values. Right? As far as I understand the idea of polyfoolishness is the eccentric way, is sort of anti-mainstream way to refresh the significance of Christian values. Right? It is a form of estrangement, we may say. Right? So that's the difference between holy fool and the trickster. But there are multiple elements. But by the way, that's why Pussy Riot they were quite persistently, maybe misleadingly, referring to the holy fool tradition, saying that we were trying to imitate holy fools in certain ways. Right.
Are there any other devils or devil-like figures in the Soviet literature other than Boland, who seems to be pretty sympathetic, just like Pilate. Plus, he does not quite come to Moscow to, wreak havoc or anything. He's just there to find his Margarita for the ball, like a hostess. So, are there any sort of pliable liminal figures in the Soviet literature you can think of?
So you're thinking about not necessarily tricksterish
They
characters?
don't. Well, I mean, devil seems to be the ultimate trickster.
Oh yeah, devil is an ultimate trickster.
Plus, he is supposed to undermine Christian values by definition. So, are there any other types? Because I can't think of any. Or other kinds.
So yes, if you have an idea,
I-
help me out here.
I'm sorry, but I want to remind the epigraph to Maestra Margarita,
Yeah,
which is
from
taken from
Goethe.
Faust. I'm a part of the force that who always wishes for evil and ends up doing good.
Right.
And so, he undermines and he doesn't.
Yeah, but that's the trickster's act. That's exactly the trickster's act of ambivalence, right? Although, of course, in Christian tradition, the Satan is quite obviously negative. And if we even look at the devil in Gogol or in Dostoevsky, they're quite different. Right? But thinking about other demonic figures, Pavel, it's a big issue. I need time. I can't improvise.
Okay, we'll talk.
But I think there are some. I just cannot.
They seem to be, Double seems to be a good candidate for the devil position. Just like Bender kind of is pliable, assumes your personality to get what he wants from you. So he kind of plays you, he becomes you in a sense. So he is as close to devil as one would get, it seems.
Yeah, and there are some details that may point out in this direction.
Yeah.
Right. At the same time, he has a tattoo of Napoleon at his chest, and so the romantic character is being played out. So definitely, Bender is indeed a paradigmatic trickster because he combines different traditions and. Even as Mikhail Odesky and Dries Feldman showed, for instance, that his famous phrase that his father was a Turkish citizen, right?
Which means
that he was Jewish.
Right.
Which is a complete sort of experiment. The Turkish citizen means that he is Jewish, right? Etc. But speaking about devil's characters, of course, with time, Stalin is depicted as a devilish character, and more so, and we can see it reaching its highest point in Vainovich, I guess, maybe some, and where in Ryzhkovsky's later works, where the characters are sated with NKVD and with the power, they are marked as devils. But devils without ambivalence, devils just like devils. Let's think about something else.
Yes. Question about Sharikov. I was thinking about how he fits in the trickster's legend. To me, he's extremely cynical, which contradicts the ideal trickster. So I was trying to think, how is he not cynical, and I could not find any answer to that.
So you say all tricksters are cynical, right? But as I'm arguing, the trickster transforms cynicism into performance, to put it in one sentence, after so many sentences that I said. Right? Sharikov is the early approach to this Soviet trickster. It appears in 1925, as we know, right? And Bulgakov, who was fond of trickster characters, he obviously doesn't depict Sharikov with fondness, right? He depicts Sharikov as a very negative character. But that's the aspect of the trickster that has been repressed in many ways, right? And that's why I'm citing Jung, because for him, the trickster is the shadow, right? The trickster is the embodiment of everything negative that the civilization produces. Right? And this vision of the trickster that has been projected or constructed by Bulgakov, it appears in the beginning of the story of the Socialist, but it didn't have a continuation. Rather, you're absolutely right. Sharikov
the successors of Sharikov, the characters that look like Sharikov, they completely lost any kind of trickster. They transformed into just simple, brutal cynics, which are Zoshenka characters, or Erdmann's characters. They don't have any kind of playfulness. Sharikov has some. Sharikov, and his playfulness is based exactly on these transformations from human into animal, from animal to human. That's a very peculiar kind of the theater, but it's theater nevertheless, right? And Zoshenka character, you remember that this famous question, how is a human being different from a beaver? And that is, there's no difference whatsoever.
Mark, I have a question about, so if a trickster is constantly changing identity, does this mean that the trickster cannot possibly have any ideology of his own whatsoever? And what do we do with Sharikov in this case? Someone who does develop an ideology, but then, yes, he's turned back into an a priori non-ideological being, back to the dog?
Yes, indeed, the trickster does have an ideology. That's sort of a non-ideological character. And I don't think that Sharikov has an ideology. Sharikov becomes a screen onto which different forces try to project their ideology, right? On the one hand, Preobrazhensky tries to project sort of the Enlightenment ideology onto him, right? And after the movie, we believe that Schwander plays an important role, projecting communist ideology onto him. But Sharikov's ideology is very much simplistic.
Yes, but
he just lives, right? He just lives and tries to get as much as possible from life. So yes, he is self-serving. I understand what you mean, right? But his self-service is indeed very much tricksterish. He wants to eat. He wants to have sex. He wants to have more. And it's not ideology. It's survival.
He wants to kill.
Cats.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think he's a trickster. And the dog itself was... there's nothing of a trickster in him.
Okay, I'll get back to my Jung.
Well, Jung is the only one, but he was not...
Jung is the only one, but you know, I was with you completely. And Sharikov was not on my list at all. Until I read Jung closely and I realized that we don't understand him. A faithful copy of an absolutely integrated human consciousness corresponds to a sign of part of the animal shadow. A variation of the shadow archetype, shadow of Preobrazhensky, right? He's a forerunner of the Savior, and like him, God, man, and animal at once. That's very, very to the point. He's both subhuman and superhuman, a bestial and divine being whose chief and most alarming characteristic is his unconsciousness. And so.
It's theory.
It is theory, but the theory... oh, come on. That's what we're doing. It's theory that fits perfectly. And this theory that has been just has been created much later. Of course, Bulgakov couldn't read Jung because Jung published this article in 1956. Yes, please.
You could read Freud.
Mark. Freud does right.
Vladimir Mark, I actually at myself, like I read your article, first article at least, like
long
read, yes. Probably like it was 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
In a law. And I remember like I was very fascinated by just like by your lenses, your point of view. Like I appreciate you. You push us to see Russian culture, Soviet culture, from this angle and from this optics. In the same time, I kind of like, I remember like I got multiple questions, and actually on the way here, I'm sorry, but I live in a small village far from here. I even print out that article and trying to find question I got like 10 years ago. At least 4 or 5 of them. I don't expect like you spend time on all 5 of them, but at least couple. It seems like in that article you reject the notion of depthness of Ivanushka Durachok. You kind of like separate this, like Ivanushka Durachok and this Trickster. You still keep this point of view, or you maybe kind of change it, or what's your?
So we are talking about Ivanushka Durachok from the fairy tale, from Russian fairy tales, right?
Excuse me?
From Russian fairy tales, right? Because of course, Durak, a fool, also can be a form of trickster. But for instance, Shveik, Slavkash's Shveik, is a very classical trickster, right? But he pretends to be a fool, right? That's his performance that allows him to survive in the most impossible situations. There are multiple fairy tales about Ivanushka Durachok, but in folklore he doesn't pretend to be a fool. He's just foolish. He's ironically удачник. He's ironic lucky man. He just doesn't try, right? And as you remember, Sinyavsky built the entire philosophy around this refusal to do anything which is sort of some kind of Russian Buddhism, following the stream of life, etc. But if we, for instance, take Ivanushka Durachok in other later variations, even in such more or less classical text as Konек Горбунок by Rushov, we see some elements of trickster. So in folk tales, I think he is not the trickster, but the productions, later productions, derivatives can be trickster.
Because it seems to me like it's much more important to define the Ivanushka Durachok related to Russian culture than like, I don't know, Sharikov, which is much later. So, next, I recall like you talk about Stop.
It's not me, it's your check. All questions to California.
Okay.
But Stop is sort of one of the
Would you give me?
But I can repeat what Yurchak writes about Stop in his book, that Stop is, so on the one hand, it is the hyper-identification with the discourse. So you pretend to play out the discourse. On the other hand, it is the decontextualization of discourse. So it's mockery of discourse, right? So we may say that Ostap Bender or many other of these tricksters, they are using Stop before this concept even appeared. But that's one of the types of performance that they employ. For instance, we may read Julio Kurita as a textbook for Stop, because what Julio Kurita is doing, he constantly appropriates some authoritative discourse and brings it to the point where it explodes, right, by hyper-identification. Remember, for instance, this episode where he builds the monument to the hero of civilization in the midst of the World War I, of course, and one of his disciples, Aisha, who was at the front and comes to his teacher, he brings his very honest, very sincere gift, a necklace made of teeth of Germans whom he killed, I don't know, Germans who killed at the war, and puts it on the neck of this monument. So, of course, we see indeed that's an example of Stop. Right, but of course this concept didn't exist. Yurchak, however, argues, and I agree with him, that Stop in our time, right, in the late 70s and 80s, becomes one of the very important forms of cultural behavior.
I did say that, but
I'm repeating what Yurchak.
No, it's I remember like you're talking about like is it that together with postmodernism, or it's could be divided and so on.
Yes, unfortunately, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but our time is
We
up.
can continue after.
Yeah, we can certainly continue.
We'll talk later.
It's okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.